Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 12th chapter in the book of Exodus. We're going to try and make it from the first verse all the way up till the 30th. Before we do that, we just want to review. The 12th chapter is the fulfillment of a promise and the execution thereof, as outlined in chapter 11. The 11th describes the 10th and final plague of Egypt, and these are the miracles which are the means of Yahweh's liberation of his people from slavery. He does 9 signs in succession, the first of which is the blood in the 7th chapter. Aaron's staff turns the Nile River into blood, so the Nile was so central to Egyptian life and agriculture and drinking and just fish. Every fish in the river died, and then but Pharaoh still hardened his heart in response because his magicians were able to duplicate the turning of the water into blood on a much smaller scale. But there are two things. For every sign that the Pharaoh receives, he hardens his heart. That certainly takes place with the frogs, gnats, and the flies and the livestock. So the animals are affected, and they're overwhelmed by animals, and each of these are a judge. Frogs, Revelation 16:13, these are spirits of demons that come out as frogs. So frogs are likened to evil entities in the ancient world. Then it gets a little personal in the 9th chapter with the 6th plague of boils. So then it starts to affect the people, and then hailstorm comes out in the 9th chapter, and then locust and darkness are the 10th chapter ones. So that is 8 and 9 in the 10th chapter. So there is one plague in chapter 7, 3 in chapter 8, 2 in chapter 9, and 3 in chapter 9, and 2 in chapter 10. And then the 11th is what we're going to review before we launch off on the lesson itself. Verse 1, and Yahweh said to Moses, I am bringing yet one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that he is going to let you go from here. When he lets you go, he shall drive you out from here altogether. Now at the end of this chapter, we read the repeated refrain that Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. So in spite of all the evidence and all the miracles, this 10th and final one was enough to get them on the way out the door of Egypt, but they ultimately had to be rescued through the Red Sea, turning into a passable land. So even after the 10th miracle, we just want to know that Pharaoh remained stubborn-hearted throughout all this. Speak now in the hearing of the people, and let every man ask from his neighbor, and every woman of her neighbor, objects of silver and objects of gold. So the infant embryonic nation of Israel, in fact, leaves Egypt enriched with much of the treasures of that land, and this is essential in the foundation and formation of their own nation. And Moses said, thus, verse 4, thus said Yahweh, about midnight I am going into the midst of Egypt. That's what we read when we'll remember the 12th chapter is the fulfillment and execution of the promise, of which is alluded to in anticipation in the 10-verse 11th chapter, whereas the 12th verse is 50 chapters. But the promise, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of the Pharaoh who sits on the throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and also the firstborn of the cattle. So that's a truly top to bottom domino effect. The Pharaoh on high, it affects him, it affects the lowest of the low in his kingdom. It also affects the cattle and the animals under his custody in the kingdom. So this plague of death is going to, and once more, there's going to be a separation between Israel and Egypt, as we read of in several of the later plagues especially. But there's going to be a great cry throughout the land. We're going to read that word towards the tail end. We're going to witness that literal fulfillment. Verse 9, but Yahweh said to Moses, Pharaoh is not going to listen to you in order to multiply my wonders in the land of Egypt. So Yahweh, in spite of having sent 10 plagues, which are miracles and signs of his judgment on Egypt, Pharaoh remained obstinately obdurate man for whom no amount of evidence could convince him to detach himself from the Hebrew slave labor. And Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh. However, Yahweh hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not let the children of Israel go out of his land. Now, Pharaoh is a creature of agency, a human being, and as such, he is not absolved of personal responsibility. But Yahweh did arrange a man to be put in the place of the position of power at this time, to be as hard-hearted and stubborn as him, to enforce the object lesson. So much of the meaning that is communicated, we learn of the meaning of this miracle, and we also learn of the rationale for the holiday and the memorial, the necessity and the urgency to keep it alive and maintained throughout the generations from its happening. And this means something to us as Christians. So heads up, we will be interpreting much of the allusions in a New Testament lens, the messianic allusions. This marks the dawn of the beginning of the lesson itself. Verse 1, chapter 12. And Yahweh spoke to Moses and to Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month is the beginning of months for you. It is the first month of the year for you. So this month in the Hebrew calendar is alternately known as Abib and Nisan. The Abib is derivative of the Canaanite language. I think Nisan is Assyrian. But in any case, it marks the new year of their religious calendar. Now, by their secular or civil calendar, they would have marked the dawn of their years at Rosh Hashanah, the month which corresponds to our month of September and October. This month corresponds to March and April, but it is when Passover begins, and this is the annual celebration of a historically significant milestone in their national identity. They were a nation without a land to call their own, and they were enslaved by another nation in another nation before they became a nation because of the Passover. And this was to mark the turning point of their calendar years for religious purposes, if not civil. Speak to all the congregations of Israel, saying, On the 10th day of this month, each one of them is to take for himself a lamb, according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. Now, the lamb in a New Testament lens is the Lamb of Yahweh, alluded to by John the Baptist in John 1:29 and 36. So inasmuch, well, we'll delve on the details more, because there are specifications and prerequisites for the atonement, the lowercase letter a atonement. They are to be sacrificed for the purpose of redemption. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of the souls. According to each man's need, make your count with the lamb. So if you are a neighbor and you have a lamb, you are by proxy. If your neighbor lacks a lamb, by sheer proxy, there is no amount of preparation or even warning to tell them to go procure a lamb. They're just saying, if your neighbor has a lamb, use his lamb, because there is an urgency about this, and the urgency is what motivates the yeastless bread. So I forget what it's called, but I think it's matzah, and it is bread without yeast, and it's actually quite good and delicious. I actually like the horseradish and the yeastless bread, matzah, combined. It's actually quite good. Let the lamb be a perfect one, a year-old male. Take it from the sheep or from the goats. So the perfect one, that just means without blemish, without physical defect. This is to be a year old, so it is to be in the ripe of its prime and the ripe of its life, when its life's just about to be taken off, in the innocency of life. And he's telling them to take it from the sheep or from the goats. So by that, we can imagine that there are three animals, in fact, involved: the lamb, the sheep, and the goat. Whatever they have at their disposal is whatever is appropriate for the accommodation of the urgency. And you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then all the assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it between the evenings. So we read that on the 10th day of the month, this is the month of Abib or Nasid, our month of March and April, they are to take a lamb. So they are, Orthodox Jews, we can imagine, do take a lamb. And then on the 14th day of the same month, so 4 days hence, they kill the lamb between the assembly, between the synagogue, between the fellowship or the gathering, and they do it between the evenings. The evening, in fact, marks the dawn of a new day in the Hebrew calendar. So their Sabbath begins on our Friday night, which they consider their Saturday morning. The seventh day of the week begins the night before, and every day of the week begins the night of before in the lunar Hebrew approach to that. And you shall keep it and they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the house where they eat it. So this blood is to be the animal that is to be slain. Their blood is to mark the signal that they are to be passed over. That's what gives the meaning to the words in the holiday itself. Passover means they were passed over by the angel of death, because remember what's going to happen. The 11th plague is foretold, and it is the death of the firstborn. This gives the sign to the angel of death, who is stalking through the entire land of Egypt, and the Hebrews are going to be marked and sealed by that lamb's blood or that goat's blood or that sheep's blood. Any animal blood on their door is what's going to save them from this. So they had the necessity for exact obedience. And they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire, with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Unleavened bread, because of the urgency of the situation. Bread takes time to magnify. To the yeast is what gives it its spreading ability, and the matzah is actually flat bread because there's no yeast, there's no expansion. So that doughy feeling, that doughy taste of bread is the result of yeast. And yeast in the New Testament is alternately likened to sin, hypocrisy in Luke 12:1, worldly and wicked desires in 1 Corinthians 5:8. So the idea is that it starts small, but then it spreads quickly from its small beginning. So it really develops, it takes a life of its own, it has its own trajectory, and it has appetites and capacities that need fulfillment and satisfaction, and it consumes on those. And they shall do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with waters, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and its inward parts. So this especially communicates the narrowness of the occasion. They didn't even have time to. They were waiting for a signal to get up and go to take the possessions of the silver and gold. That was from Egypt. They had it in their pockets, and they were awaiting a signal, and so they didn't even have time to boil it in water. They just had to roast it immediately because of the urgency of the situation. And do not leave it on until morning, and what remains of it until morning you are to burn with fire. So once the morning comes, that means there's nothing left. You have to burn it with fire. And this is how you eat it: your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Passover of Yahweh. So even though Jews in all generations since have sat down and taken great amount of preparation for this meal and entering into it within the right spiritual mindset and everything else, the Jews and the original generation did not have the luxury of the option to have that necessary preparation. There was an urgency about the moment and about the situation that couldn't wait, and the Jews had to respond accordingly, the original Jews. It is the Passover, that means they were passed over, and they have to make the most out of being spared from death, which is otherwise sweeping the land, killing the firstborn of everyone from the palace down to the gutter, down to the homeless, down to the cattle, down to the livestock. And I shall pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and shall smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the mighty ones on Egypt I shall execute judgment. I am Yahweh. So Yahweh himself declares that he will pass through the land of Egypt, and the angel of death is in fact his minion, so it is not he himself, but an angel working on his behalf and at his behest, who smites the firstborn in Egypt, excepting those who are marked by the lamb's blood or the sheep's blood or the goat's blood on their wooden doorpost, the license to kill the firstborn is extended all the way to the cattle, so the Hebrew people are not only preserving their own lives, but that of their livestock. And every one of these 10 judgments in their own way were indictments against the polytheistic pantheon of Egypt. Each of them corresponds in some way to some. So like the sun, the darkness, that was the 9th one was an indictment against Osiris or Ra. He was the sun god of Egypt, and his impotence was exposed by Yahweh, who caused the darkness to subsume the entire land. And there's one for each of the 10. We honestly don't have time to get into it, but we might save that for another lesson. And the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I shall pass over you, and let the plague not come on you to destroy you, when I smite the land of Egypt. So this is the meaning of being passed over. They are passed over from an angel who is killing everything in sight that is not marked by the blood of the lamb and everything else. So the blood is their ticket to redemption and life, in much in the same way that our lamb, the Paschal Lamb of Elohim, the atonement, the capital A atonement, is everything that is written about him. But the blood is what marks their security and their sanctuary from being slaughtered by the angel of death. And this day shall become to you a remembrance, and you shall observe it as a festival to Yahweh throughout your generations. Observe it as a festival, an everlasting law. So earlier we read that this day is to mark the new years of their new calendar. This is to be the beginning of months for you. The first month of this year for you is to be in the first day. This really marks your new lease on life. This is a new year. This is a new future. This is a new nation. So this is really their new lease on life, and as such it survives as the religious, if not the civil, new year of ancient Judaism. And is to be observed as the festival, one of the 3 festivals for which Jews of the diaspora were encouraged to return annually to Jerusalem to gather and assemble for collective worship. And it is to be preserved from start to finish throughout Judaism. It is still alive and celebrated today. It is observed as a festival and an everlasting testimony of an eternal deity working on their behalf. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. Indeed, the first day you shall cause leaven to cease from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day into the 7th day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. So there are various very serious consequences for misrepresenting the sacrifice of their ancestors. They were to be excommunicated from the covenant community if they failed to leaven their bread on this solemn memorial and occasion. So that word remembrance also brings to mind the Passover, the Last Supper, which was a Passover supper, which is our weekly or monthly communion or Eucharist or Lord's Supper or sacrament or any other name that we might call it. But there are, he's not playing around, he's not messing around with the seriousness and the gravity of its consequences. And on the first day is a sacred gathering. On the seventh day, you have a sacred gathering. No work at all is done then, only that which is eaten by every soul. That alone is prepared for you. So this is a day that is sacred above all other days. It is the dawn of a new day, the dawn of a new year, the dawn of a new beginning, the dawn of a new nation, and as such is to be immortalized and cemented in their annual calendar as a day for gathering and fellowship and worship. And on the seventh day, on the Sabbath of this day, this is to be their day of rest, so this is their lease on a new life. From the slaughtering of the Egypts, they are released from bondage of slavery. And you shall keep the Passover for you on the same day I brought your division out of the land of Egypt. And you shall keep this day throughout your generations, an everlasting law. So this ceremony, the celebration thereof, has been sustained by Judaism, and Judaism has been sustained by it from Moses' generation all the way till the present. There is a torch, a historical torch, which is passed from one generation to the next, from the original ones to receive it, all the way to the present generation, who are keeping it alive, and by connection, the Hebrew nation and Jewish people. In the first, on the 14th day of the month, in the evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month in the evening. So this celebration is to last 7 days. That is a week in the Jewish calendar. It is also so in a week, the final day of the week is a day of rest. That is the most sacred day in that week, and this is the most sacred week of their year by connection of their significance to their redemptive history and Yahweh's outstretched arm and powerful finger working in their lives and on their behalf. For 7 days no leaven is to be found in your houses, for if anyone eats what is leavened, that same being shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether sojourner or native of the land. So not a whole lot new there. We just learned once more that there is no one law for biological Jews and foreigners in the covenant community. They are all bound by the same covenantal law, and if you live as a foreigner in Israel, you are not permitted to live as a foreigner, an idolater, or a polytheist. You are commanded to follow the dictates and the customs of the Hebrew people, and it's the Jewish religion. Do not eat that which is leavened. In all your dwellings you are to eat unleavened bread. So they are to eat it in the way of their ancestors in remembrance and out of respect and homage to their ancestors, who really were given a moment's notice and responded accordingly. They were people who had been waiting for liberation, screaming to the sky and the heavens for some 430 years. And then finally their prayers answered, and Yahweh sent Moses in a basket to liberate him through a providential plan. And Moses called for the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go out and take lambs for yourself according to your clans and slaughter the Passover." So Moses is telling the elders to fulfill and execute the meaning of this by making the Passover real. They have to kill the blood, so why not go make it real? Why not go make it efficacious? Why not make it go manifest? If we don't do this now, the angel of death will slay our firstborn in their cribs. If we don't slaughter the Passover, the lamb, the goat, the anything else, our firstborn will be slaughtered by the angel of death. And if you shall take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts in the blood that is in the basin, and none of you shall go out of the door of the house until morning. So hyssop is an instrument. David sings of it, or writes of it, and sings of it also in Psalm 51, hyssop, wash me with hyssop. So hyssop is something that would have been ceremonially cleansing, and the blood is what really cleanses us. The blood of the Messiah cleanses us from all iniquity, if we read this in a messianic lens, and that verse comes from 1 John 1:7. But how the Hebrew people signalize it and what they do with the blood, they do not mark themselves, but they mark their doors with it. We as Christians are to mark ourselves theoretically and metaphorically as washed in the blood. And Yahweh shall pass on to smite the Egyptians, and shall see the blood of the lintel and the 2 doorposts. And Yahweh shall pass over the door, and not allow the destroyer to come into your house to smite you. So because they had fulfilled these obligations and done their duty as to the instructions, they would be spared of life, spared from death, their firstborns anyway. So the blood of the lamb is what saves them from having to cleanse up the blood of their firstborn, who would otherwise be killed in his bed and in his sleep. And not only that, but their animals. So the destroyer is the angel of death. He is the one sent to destroy, and an angel of death also wiped out. An angel of death can wipe out an entire nation, an army of a nation. So as the angel of death wiped out the Assyrian armies, the 185,000 of them that were surrounding Jerusalem in the days of Hezekiah, he can do the same to the Egyptians. And you shall keep this word as a law for you and your sons forever. So once more, this is to be sustained Judaism and be sustained by Judaism. It is connects them to the Eternal One, and as such is to be reserved in perpetuity from one generation to the next as a living and lasting testimony to the living and loving Yahweh who saves and redeems. And it shall be when your children say to you, what does this service mean to you? Then you shall say, it is the Passover slaughtering of Yahweh, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt, when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our households, and the people bowed their heads and did obeisance. So they are to know the answer when their children ask, what does this all mean? They are to supply that answer, and they are to know that it is the Passover sacrifice of our ancestors who were passed over from the angel of death, the plague of the death of the firstborn, which otherwise afflicted the entire land of Egypt, save our households. This demands obedience and response. It demands to be sustained and observed by all generations, and to have its meaning preserved intact. These partakers and preservers of the celebration must be knowing what they are preserving. And the children of Israel went away and did so, as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron, and so they did. So that element of just obedience and faith, a faithful response is an obedient one. So Moses and Aaron, they did as they were told, no element of argument. And it came to be at midnight that Yahweh smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. So that connects us and reminds us of a passage in the 11th verse when we read that even the maidservant, so here it goes even lower, the captive in the dungeon, that was where Joseph found himself before he was exalted and elevated in Egypt, making a new home for the progeny of his father, Jacob, in the process of liberating a nation. But then a Pharaoh came who knew not Joseph and enslaved them and oppressed them. We only have one more verse, verse 30. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not a dead one. So we witnessed the fulfillment of a promise. Remember, we read that earlier in the 11th chapter, that there would be a great cry throughout the land, and this is fulfilled by Pharaoh, who is personally affected, and this temporarily, but doesn't really unharden his heart. He is moved to let the people go for a moment. But that's all. We'd like to say more, but that's honestly all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.